Welcome to Reformed Thinking, the deep dive where we cut through the noise and theological static to deliver the knowledge and insight you need straight from the source. Okay, let's unpack this. Today we are undertaking a really critical deep dive into the very heart of the Reformation's claims about salvation. We're looking at key excerpts from John Calvin's Commentaries on Paul's letter to the Galatians, and we're zeroing in on chapter 2. The chapter is, incredibly high stakes. It's a sharp look at apostolic integrity, Christian liberty, and of course the absolute necessity of justification by faith alone. Our source is Calvin's own words, which give us not just a scholarly verse-by-verse explanation, but also a powerful, a very historically situated argument against legalism and compromise doctrine.
What's so fascinating here is that Paul grounds his central doctrine not in some abstract philosophy, but in concrete personal history. He uses his own travel accounts and, the high-stakes confrontation he had with the chief of the apostles, Peter, to establish the divine origin and purity of his gospel. It's not just biography. It's a demonstration of his theological certainty, and it's designed to silence anyone who questioned his standing or his message. So our deep dive today will follow Paul's three critical movements in this chapter. First, his confirmed authority during the meeting in Jerusalem, then the necessary and very public conflict with Peter in Antioch, and finally, the resulting theological declaration that justification is solely by the faith of Christ, which is really the necessary takeaway from the whole affair.
Right. So let's start at the beginning of the chapter with the chronology. This is something Calvin takes great pains to clarify. Paul recounts a specific journey to Jerusalem 14 years after his conversion. For you, the learner, the timeline can be a bit tricky because Paul made several visits. Calvin tackles this puzzle head on.
He does. He suggests this visit is actually the second journey Paul describes in Acts, the one where he brought relief funds to Judea during the famine. We see that in Acts 12.
Okay, so not the big Jerusalem council in Acts 15?
No, and it's critical that Calvin places it before that council.
Why is that so important?
Well, that earlier dating is just essential to the logic of the whole letter. If Paul had written this account after the council decree in Acts 15, his opponents could have just said he was complying with the church's official findings.
So it would have made his gospel look secondary, derivative.
Exactly. But by placing this meeting earlier, Paul supports his claim that his gospel was independent, that he received it directly from God. And, Calvin also reasons that if the whole controversy over ceremonies had already been settled by that official decree, then Peter would have hardly engaged in the kind of dissimulation, that hypocritical retreat from the Gentiles that we see later in Antioch.
Right. His fear of offending the Jews wouldn't make sense if the matter was already formally decided.
That's it. It suggests the issue was still considered doubtful or unsettled, which reinforces that earlier timeline.
Okay, so that brings us to the why of the journey. Paul emphasizes he went up to Jerusalem according to Revelation. That phrase seems to define the entire visit.
It does. It means he didn't go to seek permission or instruction or even validation from the other apostles. He went because God told him to go.
For the purpose of having his doctrine confirmed.
Right. And that distinction, between seeking confirmation and seeking authorization, that's what sets Paul's apostleship apart.
He communicated his gospel. He didn't submit it for approval.
Precisely. He explained the doctrine he was already preaching to those of reputation, the pillars, James, Peter, and John. And Calvin is so clear on this, they did not prescribe or add a single thing to what Paul should teach. They just listened and expressed concurrence.
They acknowledged his apostleship. They didn't create it.
Yes, and that immediately establishes his office as having a divine origin, which cuts off any opponent who might claim his message was secondhand.
Okay, but hold on. Let me stop you there. If his gospel was truly from God, why did he risk undermining it by needing human confirmation at all? Isn't that a compromise? Why even bother, as he says, lest by any means I should run or had run in vain?
That's a great question, and Calvin addresses it directly. Paul doesn't mean that God's word fails if people reject it.
Okay.
He means his work might be rendered ineffectual to men. It might not produce the proper spiritual building up, the edification in the wider church, if his doctrine was seen as conflicting with the original apostles.
So it's less about his own certainty and more about the peace and certainty of the new believers.
Exactly. He understood that sound doctrine, when it's questioned or presented alongside conflicting reports, is just a massive opportunity for the devil to sow division and shake weak consciences.
So agreement among the teachers helped stabilize the faith of the flock.
Yes, he wanted that unity of message to remove all the unnecessary hindrances, even though, fundamentally, the certainty of faith rests only on the naked truth of God.
It's not about checking his facts. It's about removing stumbling blocks for other people.
That's it. If the most respected authorities disagreed, the fledgling church would have just fractured.
And Calvin saw this in his own time, right?
He did. He talked about the mournful controversy over the Lord's Supper and how disagreement among respected leaders can affect even strong believers. So if that happens over the sacrament, just imagine the chaos caused by disagreement over the very nature of justification. Paul was trying to prevent the scattering of the weak.
This brings us to the test case who was right there in the room with them, Titus. Paul brought Titus, an uncircumcised Greek, and he deliberately was not compelled to be circumcised. This is where Paul drew his line in the sand.
Right, and to understand the tension, we have to define the status of the ceremonial law at that time. As Calvin reminds us, circumcision itself was a diaphora, a matter of indifference, morally neutral.
Yeah, Paul could use it or not use it, depending on the situation.
He did. He famously circumcised Timothy because Timothy's mother was Jewish, and he wanted to avoid offending weak Jews he was trying to reach.
But with Titus, he stood firm. He says he refused to yield, not for an hour. So what made the difference between Timothy's situation and Titus's?
The difference was the intention and the demand. Paul saw the malignant intent of the false brethren, who weren't looking for edification of the weak. They wanted to spy out our liberty and bring everyone back into bondage.
So they weren't asking, they were demanding. They were saying this was necessary for righteousness.
That's it. And if Paul had yielded to that demand, if he'd circumcised Titus in that context, he would have functionally affirmed their false teaching.
He would have confirmed that salvation required something in addition to Christ.
And that single action would have crushed Christian liberty for every Gentile believer.
So the issue wasn't the surgery, it was the theological surrender.
Exactly. The duty of loving our neighbor, which calls for mildness, should never be injurious to faith. Faith and the truth of the gospel have to be the priority. And Calvin uses this to distinguish between two types of opponents: the weak brother, who you bear with in love, and the concealed foe, who you must vigorously resist.
The goal, Paul says, was that the truth of the gospel might continue with you.
And Calvin defines that truth as the genuine purity and entire doctrine of Christ. He gives a stark warning. Even the smallest departure from the simplicity that is in Christ gives the gospel a false and disguised aspect.
Add one human tradition as a necessary component, and you've ruined the whole thing. And this is where Calvin applies Paul's logic to his own time, isn't it? He critiques those who would compromise doctrine.
He does. He says simply retaining the name of the gospel is not enough if its solid purity is lost by mixing in human inventions or works righteousness. You have to remember, this is Calvin in the 16th century, using Paul's defensive purity to critique the structure and practices of the Roman Church as he saw them.
So for him, it wasn't just ancient history, it was a current controversy.
Not at all. He argues that trying to find a middle ground in doctrine, as if it's a negotiation, is destructive. Paul's refusal to yield, even for an hour, shows that if the gospel is not pure, it ceases to be the true, liberating gospel.
Okay, moving on. Paul now addresses his standing relative to the established apostles. He talks about those who seem to be somewhat, James, Peter, John, and he uses language that sounds almost boastful. He says, "It maketh no matter to me, God accepteth no man's person."
Calvin calls this holy boasting, and it was totally necessary for doctrinal stability.
How so?
If Paul had admitted that he learned his gospel from them, his opponents, the Judaizers, would have immediately claimed his previous teaching was flawed or secondary.
Right, it would have undermined his authority and the message itself.
So by saying God accepteth no man's person, he rejects any prestige tied to their rank or reputation. He's saying that in spiritual matters, outward distinctions are irrelevant to God's calling. The rank of the man doesn't change the truth of the message.
And the practical outcome was confirmation, not contribution. He stresses that the pillars added nothing to his doctrine.
Right. They heard his gospel, they agreed it was the same message they held, and they had nothing to add to it. And this leads directly to the acknowledged division of labor in verses 7 through 9. The pillars saw the grace given to Paul and acknowledged that the gospel of the uncircumcision was committed to him.
Just as the gospel of the circumcision was unto Peter.
Right. And Paul proves his ministry was sealed by his effectiveness. He shows his province, the Gentiles, was his own because God wrought effectually in him.
That manifestation of divine energy was the sign that his office was sanctioned by God.
And this division of labor is precisely why they extended the right hands of fellowship to Paul and Barnabas. It confirmed a partnership, not a hierarchical submission. Paul was their equal.
And Calvin, of course, saw this as a direct challenge to the later Roman claim of Peter's universal primacy.
Absolutely. He argues that if Peter's apostleship had a primary reference to the Jews, the circumcision, then any successor claiming primacy from Peter should logically exercise it over the Jews, not claim universal jurisdiction over the Gentiles, which Paul was explicitly given.
It sets them up as equals with different jurisdictions.
It does.
That brings us to the surprisingly simple final request from the pillars in verse 10. After all that, the only thing they asked was that Paul should remember the poor in Judea.
Which he was already eager to do.
Right.
It's a beautiful moment. Their only concern was practical Christian charity, showing that true Christian liberty flows naturally into love and concern for others. It doesn't get trapped in doctrinal control or imposing new burdens.
Yeah, it ends the meeting on a note of genuine brotherly love after all the hard lines were drawn.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now the mood shifts entirely. We go from mutual confirmation in Jerusalem to outright public confrontation in Antioch. Paul declares, when Peter was come to Antioch, I withstood him to the face because he was to be blamed.
A huge moment. And we have to stick with Calvin's timeline here. This had to have happened before the Acts 15 decree.
Right, because if the decree was already published, Peter would have had no reason to fear offending the men who came from James by eating with Gentiles.
None at all. It places the fault squarely on Peter's individual fear and his lack of resolution.
So let's break down Peter's behavior. When he first got to Antioch, everything was fine.
Yes, he was living in full Christian liberty, eating freely, openly with the Gentiles, acknowledging their equal standing. That was correct Christian practice.
But then the Jewish visitors arrived.
And his fear got the better of him. He withdrew and separated himself, fearing them which were of the circumcision. This wasn't just bad manners. This was the sin of dissimulation, hypocrisy.
He was basically signaling with his lunch choices that the Gentile believers were somehow unclean or incomplete.
That's it. He was imposing an unjust condition, the yoke of the law, on them to restore fellowship. His fear of the Jews led him to functionally deny the liberty of the gospel.
And the scandal immediately became systemic.
Yes, Calvin highlights that destructive ripple effect. The other Jews dissembled likewise with him. Peter's hypocrisy swept away even Barnabas, Paul's longtime partner.
Wow.
It just shows how quickly poor leadership and the fear of man can corrupt an entire community and threaten to split the church along legalistic cultural lines. It was a genuine crisis.
That seems incredibly harsh, though, chastising the most senior apostle in public. Was there no gentler way?
Well, Calvin is very firm that Paul's action teaches a vital lesson about accountability. He chastised Peter publicly before them all, precisely because the offense was public and was demonstrably dangerous.
The integrity of the gospel itself was at stake.
Exactly. The most dangerous scandal was the potential tearing apart of the church, the threat to Christian liberty, and the practical overturning of the doctrine of grace. When that's on the line, public sin requires public correction.
And this also works as an argument against Peter's supposed infallibility or untouchable primacy.
A massive one. Peter, the chief apostle of the circumcision, submissively bowed to the chastisement from Paul, his equal in ministry.
So what was Paul's actual reproof? The logic he used is just magnificent.
It is. He says to him, "If thou, being a Jew, livest after the manner of Gentiles, and not as do the Jews, why compellest thou the Gentiles to live as do the Jews?"
The hypocrisy couldn't be clear.
Not at all. Peter, a Jew, was enjoying the freedom of the gospel himself, eating Gentile food, but then he used the hammer of social exclusion to pressure the Gentiles to Judaize.
And that word compellest is the key.
It's the whole crux of it. He was using social and emotional pressure to impose the law, and in doing so, he was robbing believers of the very liberty the gospel provides. His fear led him to choose social comfort over doctrinal truth.
It shows that gospel purity isn't just about what you say, it's about what you do.
Yes. Their conduct was a practical denial of the doctrine they confessed. To bind the consciences of godly men through social pressure was to buy temporary unity at the price of freedom and truth.
So Paul didn't just tell Peter off. He turned this public confrontation into the definitive statement on salvation. He uses it as a launching pad.
That's the pivot. The confrontation immediately transitions into Paul's formal, powerful declaration of justification by faith alone. He moves from Peter's failure in conduct to the foundation of the Christian life.
It starts in verse 15.
Yes, and he starts by speaking from that privileged Jewish perspective. Quote, "We who are Jews by nature and not sinners of the Gentiles."
Right, the Jews had the covenant advantage. They were considered holy by nature.
And then Paul uses this supposed advantage to build his strongest conclusion.
Which is, if even we, with all our inherited advantages, were forced to seek salvation through Christ, how much more must the Gentiles rely entirely on faith alone? It just leveled the playing field.
It does. And that brings us to the core theological statement. We, being Jews, have believed in Jesus Christ, that we might be justified by the faith of Christ, and not by the works of the law. For by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified.
Okay, let's spend some time here. This is the cornerstone of Reformed thinking.
Yeah.
What did Paul mean by works of the law? Because the false apostles were only arguing about ceremonies like circumcision.
Right, but Paul's response is comprehensive. Calvin completely rejects the view that this only means ceremonies, a view some earlier figures held.
So the moral law has to be included. Why?
Because Paul is contrasting two complete, mutually exclusive systems of justification. The righteousness from law versus the righteousness from faith. To be justified by the law, any law, moral or ceremonial, requires one thing: absolute, uninterrupted perfection.
Which is impossible.
For any mortal, yes. The law demands perfect obedience to every part. And since we have zero balance in our account of merit, seeking justification through the law is completely futile.
So works of the law includes any human effort to achieve a right standing with God.
Correct. And that comprehensive scope is what forces us entirely into the arms of Christ's free acceptance.
That clarity is what gives the statement its exclusive nature. Justification not by works, but by the faith of Christ alone.
And that's the absolute point of conflict. That statement admits no exception. The false apostles didn't reject Christ. They just demanded that works be joined with Christ.
And if Paul had conceded that, the controversy would have stopped.
It would have stopped, but the gospel would have been ruined. This is why Calvin totally rejects any idea of half justification, where faith and works share the glory.
It can't be both.
It can't. For us to seek the righteousness of Christ, we first have to see ourselves as poor, destitute, and stripped of any righteousness of our own. The doctrine of justification by faith alone leaves no room for human boasting.
But Paul knew his opponents would have a countercharge. In verse 17, they basically say, if faith makes Jews sinners just like Gentiles, doesn't that make Christ the minister of sin?
Right. Doesn't Christ just take away our righteousness and strengthen sin's power? And Paul rejects this with utter abhorrence, God forbid.
So how does he answer it?
He clarifies that Christ didn't bring sin. He merely unveiled the sin that was already concealed under the false disguise of Jewish holiness. The grace of Christ just levels the playing field. Christ came to destroy the works of the devil, not build them up or give sin a new license.
And the direct reply is in verse 19, where he shifts the blame back to the law itself. For I, through the law, am dead to the law, that I might live unto God. How does the law kill us?
It kills our self-reliance. When you truly perceive the law, when you see that it demands flawless obedience and condemns the smallest imperfection, it just leaves you in despair. It drives you away from trusting in it.
So that's its proper function, to kill the sinner's confidence in their own merit.
Yes, but this death is not mortal. It's the cause of a better life, to live unto God. To be dead to the law is to renounce its dominion as a covenant of works.
We're free to live for God, governed by gratitude, not fear.
Exactly.
And this leads into that magnificent paradox in verse 20. I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me.
By being engrafted into Christ's death, we derive a secret spiritual energy. The entire bill of guilt, the curse of the law, is nailed to his cross. We are delivered from the law's yoke only by becoming one with him.
And yet he says, I live.
Right, the paradox. Our bodily life continues. We live in the flesh. We still eat, drink, and work. But the true, animating life is hidden. It's animated by the secret spiritual power of Christ, enjoyed inwardly by the faith of the Son of God.
So Calvin makes it clear Christ lives in us in two ways, governing us by his Spirit for regeneration and making us partakers of his righteousness for justification.
Yes, and faith grants this life because it rests entirely on Christ's action, who loved me and gave himself for me. This is the foundation of the believer's security.
That sequence, he loved us and gave himself for us, shows it's all free grace. His death had no other reason than unconditional love.
And those last two words, for me, are so emphatic, so essential. It's not enough to view Christ as dying for the world generally. Paul makes it personal.
The individual believer has to claim it.
You have to. Atonement, cleansing, satisfaction, all the benefits are represented in this unique personal gift of himself. The doctrine is only truly understood when that personal claim is grasped.
And then Paul brings the whole argument to a thunderous close in verse 21. The charge of ingratitude. I do not frustrate the grace of God.
To frustrate the grace of God means to make it void, to make it useless. And to seek other aids for salvation, like works, is exactly what does that. I mean, if Christ has offered such invaluable grace at such an immense cost, how dreadful is the ingratitude in despising it by trying to add our own supplements?
Which brings us to the final crushing argument. For if righteousness come by the law, then Christ is dead in vain.
It's a perfect piece of logic that forces a choice. If we could produce even one drop of righteousness of our own, then Christ suffered unnecessarily.
You can't be a captive who also simultaneously freed yourself.
Exactly. This argument is aimed right at those who tried to unite the grace of Christ with works. He knew they didn't fully reject Christ, but by adding human effort, they fundamentally corrupted the grace he offered.
The logic is conclusive. If justification is by the law, Christ is dead in vain.
It is. Paul's justification has to be absolutely perfect. He can't allow works any claim at all, not one drop of contribution. And that is the ultimate lesson he derives from that public confrontation with Peter. Doctrinal purity is paramount and tolerates no compromise.
So what does this all mean for us today? Paul's confrontation with the pillars, and especially his public correction of Peter, it shows us that doctrinal purity is paramount. The integrity of the gospel has to be maintained, even if it means publicly correcting the most senior figures in the church. For you, the learner, the key here is the absolute certainty of justification by faith alone. Calvin assures us that the law itself plays its role by driving us to Christ, stripping us of any boast in our own works. Our true life is now hidden with Christ, animated by his secret power, and sustained by his love for us specifically.
And this deep dive really reveals that true Christian liberty in Christ is defined by what we are not bound to do. We aren't bound by the law as a means of earning righteousness. And that freedom is what enables us to fulfill the only command the pillars gave, to remember the poor, a concern that flows from spontaneous love and gratitude, not from legal necessity.
Right.
Now, here's something to think about. Consider the nature of dissimulation in our own context. If Peter, an acknowledged pillar, could be carried away by the fear of men to compromise the truth in his everyday conduct, signaling that some people are less accepted than others based on external behavior, where might we in our own lives or communities be tempted to choose social comfort or cultural tradition over the pure and entire doctrine of the gospel? Something for you to mull over.